These unconventional times require unconventional conversations. Listen in as your host, Richard Gordon, engages in one-on-one conversations with numerous leaders, elected officials, politicians, and others to learn what's happening in your state, on the Hill, and across America. Now, here's the host of Unconventional Times, Richard Gordon.
Welcome to Unconventional Times. Thank you for joining us today. Appreciate it. It's always good to see you. So thank you for being with us today. We named the show Unconventional Times because they were when we did it, but they are getting more and more unusual as we move on. And these are definitely unusual times. And we've seen a lot of upheaval in the last month or 6 weeks or so since the change of administrations. A lot of changes going on. A lot of it is the way it always is, from one administration, especially one party to another. But we've seen upheaval in Washington, across the country, and in corporate America. And as we look at these issues and trying to understand them, I figured who better to talk to us than someone who really knows the topic and knows the topic well. So today's guest is Jason Greer. Jason is the founder and president of Greer Consulting, which is a national labor management and employee relations firm that's located in St. Louis. But Jason works everywhere. And if you're looking at him on the screen and going, wait a minute, I've seen that guy before. Well, it's because you have. He's been on CNN, he's been on ABC, he's been on Fox, he's been on CNBC. You've seen him in the Wall Street Journal, you've seen him in Forbes, you've seen him really in a lot of places. And now you're seeing him on Unconventional Times. So, Jason Greer, welcome to the
Hey, how are
show.
you, sir? Hey, thanks
I'm
for having me.
great.
I'm really looking forward to this.
Well, as am I. Listen, thank you for taking the time. I know you're a busy guy. Things are changing very quickly and very
There.
rapidly, and your insights will be great. A lot of people are just confused, Jason. They're just like, "Oh my God, I don't understand what is going on." So maybe you could help us, make us understand it a little better and steer through it a little bit. So, if you don't mind, I would like to start our conversation with the mass firings. I was trying to
Yeah.
think of another way to put it, but I'd really like to talk to you to begin about what is going on with the federal government, the huge number of people that are they're
Mhm.
being laid off. First of all, I'm trying to think. Have you ever seen anything like this governmentally before?
Governmentally, no. Corporately, every other day, right? So
Really?
yeah. What's interesting to me about this is when we consider the mass firings. I mean, you can go online, you can see just the sheer carnage of and the sheer upheaval of federal employees. And I say this as a former federal employee, I was a board agent with the National Labor Relations Board, so I have an intimate knowledge of what it's like to be a government, the lifestyle of government employee, from the workplace, from the setting, from the sheer comfort, right, of being a government employee to what we currently have going on right now. We've never seen anything like this. And it's not like these folks were given, within a year, we're going to see, half of the Department of Defense shelved. We're going to see the US aid, or however you say it, shelved. We're going to see this, this, this. No, it was Trump was inaugurated. President Trump was inaugurated on whatever date that was. Was it February 20th or whatever it was?
January
January,
20th.
January 20th. Thank you.
Yeah.
And then a day later, you legitimately see all this systematic change. I've never seen anything like it before from a
So,
governmental standpoint.
So let me ask you about, I want to come back to the corporate side of this at some point in our conversation, but let's stick with the federal just for the time being.
Sure.
And I also want to talk to you about the NLRB, which is part of this. Um, how does this work? I mean, how does this work? I mean, in past times,
Hmm.
for example, President Clinton had the Vice President Gore, work on a streamlining government type of system. Um,
Right.
Looked fine, didn't do a heck of a lot, but that's fine. What's the story here? Like Elon Musk, unelected, unappointed, not approved by the Senate. What
Hmm.
authority does he have to do this? And, well, do people have to listen to him?
Yeah, great question. Fundamentally, Elon Musk has no authority. When you look at Doge has no constitutional power.
And
In
DOGE is
fact,
the Department of Governmental Efficiency that has been set
right.
up by the president. Right.
Exactly, exactly. So when you look at Doge as an entity, Doge is really nothing more than a flashlight, right? And when I say it's a flashlight, it's hey, we found this department and they do XYZ, we think, and they spend XYZ in terms of money, so let's cut them. Really from a pure constitutional standpoint, Doge does not have power to make, federal cuts. It has power. It doesn't even really have power to recommend beyond being a consultant. But I think, what I say to people is my heart goes out to the number of federal workers who have found themselves, you know, without jobs. In many cases, they are housing displaced now, right? When you look at the impact that this is having on Maryland, when you look at the impact this is having on Washington, D.C., because now all of a sudden people who, in November, they knew that their mortgage was going to be paid. In December, they knew their mortgage was going to be paid. In January, now not so certain. February, now not so certain. And I'm so sorry. We just got somebody just rang our doorbell. So my heart goes out to these folks.
Yeah.
But I often say to people, because I've had this question come up time and time again, have you ever seen this happen before? Look, as a consultant, I have had the honor and pleasure to serve the kings and queens of industry, which means that I don't care if it's healthcare, I don't care if it's tech, I don't care if it's, you know, hospitality, hotels, whatever the case might be. I have helped organizations who have acquired properties, who've acquired businesses, go in to actually make determinations as to what departments are redundant, what roles are redundant, what can we actually absorb, who can we absorb. But understand what I'm talking about, sir. I'm talking about a process. A
Right.
process that says if we, the acquiring company, have this culture and the acquired company we think has a culture, let's go in to understand what that culture is like. Let's go in and understand how we can get the best of what human resources does in our organization and what the best that human resources department does in the acquired organization and either merge the two or unfortunately, redline some people out the door and help them on to their next endeavor.
But isn't that
So,
completely different from what is going on now? I mean,
and that's, yes.
how do you have the opportunity to make the critical analysis that you're discussing? Where I go in and, my nephew did this actually. He worked for a company and they would buy a bank and they would say, well, whose checking account do we use? Whose
Mhm.
checking account is better? And let's change
Yes.
this one without. How do you do that if you just fire everybody and it's done in a matter of days?
And that's part of the challenge. And please understand when I say that's the challenge, I can't cast, I'm looking at this objectively. I'm looking at this objectively in terms of the fallout, but I'm looking at this objectively in terms of my experience. Objectively, I'll say that when you decide that you're going to fire wholesale departments, oftentimes when you do that, you have something to back it up with. You have something to backfill it with, right? So we're going to get rid of XYZ department within the acquired company because we know that our particular department, our particular program is robust enough to not only absorb some of the fallout that comes with losing that, but we're robust and smart enough to rally with the times. But in the case of what Doge is doing, in the case of what's going on in the federal government, you're doing these wholesale purges that in the short term sounds good because it riles the base. But in the long term, you don't know what the impact is because you don't even quite know what those people did. The people, and I'm talking about the people that you got rid of, right? And again, this is not a political discussion. This is more of an operational systemic discussion. It's we've gotten so used to the federal government and the way that the federal government does things that we assume we know what people do, but we're not really going to understand how good, how structured, how important they are until 6 months down the line when all of a sudden my parents who draw Social Security, my dad's 87, my mom, I can't tell you her age because she'll
Right.
kill me.
We don't want to
She's
get in
83.
trouble here.
She's 83. But
Bless
they
them.
God bless my parents. I love them dearly, but you're talking about folks who are dependent upon Social Security, who are dependent upon Medicaid, who are dependent upon Medicare, right? Who it was just assumed I hit a certain age and I get these programs. Now you have my mom who is as cool as ice. My mom's incredible. But now all of a sudden she's starting to drop things in conversations like, um, what happens if they cut out Social Security? What happens to us?
They depend
Blessedly,
upon it.
blessedly, I'm in a position where if that happens, I can take care of my parents. That's okay. But what about the sheer number of millions of people across the nation we're so dependent upon these programs to the point where we are losing them. That's a fear that people have.
Yeah, and you hear this every day. But what you say begs the question of whether this is the right thing and the appropriate thing to do.
Sure.
And it really begs the question of whether, you said we're not political, but is it not political? When you get rid of
Hmm.
USAID, I mean,
Hmm.
look, if you walk out on the street and you stop people and you
Hmm.
say, are we giving too much money in foreign aid? I will tell you, overwhelmingly, they will say yes. They will say something like,
Sure.
I'd rather give money to Appalachia. I'd rather give money to urban centers, whatever it is. Let's feed our own children first. I think you're going to hear that a lot.
Right.
People don't understand that USAID is a foreign uh, uh, part of our foreign affairs. It's what makes us strong. I mean, by giving
Absolutely.
money to Ukraine for the children of Ukraine helps us. Giving money and stopping malaria in Africa helps us. And if we don't do it, someone else is going to do it. What you're saying um, makes me wonder, is it just political? Is it a political decision? Is it Are we trying to, you talked about efficiency before when you're merging companies, how you advise companies on, hmm, this department does a better job than that department. Let's keep department A.
Hmm.
If you do this with a hatchet, or excuse me, with a chainsaw, how do you have the time?
Chainsaw. I'll never forget that
Exactly,
chainsaw.
please. How do you have the time? How do you have the time to do the analysis? And if you don't do the analysis, then why are you making these choices? One would have to think it's political.
One would have to think it's political, but one would also have to think it's economic, right? Because it's political from the perspective of you have, look, I say this as a proud 51-year-old man. I have lived a life where I've understood what it's like to be cast as the bad person, what it's like to be cast as the outsider who's coming to take your job in the form of being African American. So I understand the politics of, in order to galvanize a base, you have to have an enemy. That's one. On the other side of that, from an economic standpoint, when you have Elon Musk and his Doge organization that's taking a chainsaw to these organizations, right, to these departments, to this really the bedrock of our country, right? You have to wonder from an economic standpoint, what does he stand to gain?
Mhm.
Then you look at the fact that you have billions of dollars that SpaceX, Tesla, whatever his other companies are, have already made in terms of from the federal government. Then you start to wonder, okay, is this just political? Because it might be political from President Trump, it might be economic from Elon Musk, because you get rid of these folks in the federal government, well, they're going to have to be backfilled some form or fashion. Now you're talking about the privatization of the federal government, but who's in line to, really enact the privatization of the federal government? Well, it's the person who has intimate knowledge of what the federal government did, and that potentially is Elon Musk. So I
You
look
think
at it
that's
again.
what's going on?
I wouldn't
The
be surprised.
privatization of the American government, is that what you think is happening?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, when we look at this, uh, you know, I talked about an acquisition. Well, really, this is kind of a hostile takeover, right? It's a hostile takeover. And I've been a part of, and I've seen that happen on multiple fronts. So it's, let's get rid of all these folks. We'll make do with the carnage because we, the people, and when I say we, the people, I'm saying the people who are actually making these decisions can afford it, right? Because they're still going to make sure they get paid, right?
Right.
But I think from and I'm sitting here reading the tea leaves. This is a hostile takeover. But in the process of the hostile takeover, the federal government still has to run. The federal government still has to run. Well, we have to backfill those positions. Why not backfill it from a private perspective? And I think that's what's going to happen.
You brought up your mother, and
Mhm.
your mother's a great I don't know your mom, but I know millions of people like your mother.
Sure.
Obviously not as nice and kind and good, but like your mother. Um, People like the concept of getting rid of waste and efficiency. And I'm sure
Mm,
everyone thinks the government is just bloated with waste and efficiency. And obviously we always pick on the whatever it is, the $1 million toilet bowl or whatever it is. That's just the way it is. And
sure.
there is a lot of that in government. People think maybe it's $1 trillion. Maybe it's $1 trillion. But we're looking at for example, the tax cut that they're talking about is $4.5 trillion dollars.
Mhm.
There's a massive gap here. I mean, I don't get me wrong, I think $1 trillion is a ridiculous amount of money,
Sure.
but it's nowhere near what we're talking about. Nowhere near. And the numbers that Doge is coming up with, 2 days later, they pull them down because they're wrong. So
Yeah.
is there really the type of money we're talking about here? Again, Jason, it goes to the point of why are you doing this? No one's going to disagree with getting rid of waste and efficiencies. But your mom needs services.
Yes.
Everyone needs services. We all
Yes.
depend on our government. And lots of times we don't think about when you hear these people saying, let's rip down the government. Well, that's fine until their mother's Medicare check doesn't show up. Or
Yes.
I talk to businesses every day. They're scared stiff. How do I get a permit? What happens if there's no EPA? How does the FDA approve something if there are no employees? Isn't that the point?
That's the point. It's look, we are a country. I saw this poll, this, and I spend a lot of time by myself. I travel, 200 plus days out of the year, so I have nothing to do other than watch Netflix and read. All right, and so I, I'm often quoting, some article that I read or something that I saw, and I read this article that said that America fundamentally has such, our economy has such a bad public relations, public image because and it needs a new PR. It needs a new public relations manager because our economy is incredible. Our economy had been past tense, had been the stuff of legends to the point where other countries are trying to copy what we do. But when you talk to the average American about the state of the economy, they quote the price of eggs. They talk
Right.
about how bad things are. We talk about the loneliness gap. We talk about all these various things that are happening in America. What you sort of realize is I don't care if you are poor in Alabama all the way to rich in Silicon Valley, right? Sort of the spoiled children who don't know how good we have it. So in the process of, not knowing how good we have it, and all of a sudden we sit back and say, well, this is wrong, this is wrong, this is wrong. And through the sheer power of social media, now we're being inundated 24/7 with everything that we think is wrong in America. So the idea is, well, strip this, strip this, strip this, strip this, and let's get back to quote unquote making America great again. But you don't realize that America is already great. America is fundamentally great, but we're so spoiled that we don't see it. Now you strip away the very bedrock of the thing that makes America great, which is my parents, and I keep using the example of my parents, working their butts off, providing for me, allowing me to have a fantastic life growing up, allowing me to have a fantastic life in terms of being educated, being loved, being cherished. And then I see my parents hit that retirement age. There's certain things that they paid into the system to have. There's certain things that they trusted the federal government to provide for them into the day that they go onto the ancestral land. Now, if all of a sudden you take those things away, now we begin to recognize that, man, maybe we really do need the federal government. So even when you get back to the original point that you brought up about, you eradicate this, and $1 trillion sounds like a lot, but when our debt is, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of trillions of dollars, these cuts that we're talking about at the federal level don't even amount to a penny compared to the amount of debt that we have. So
Right.
if we're talking about how do we systematically eradicate debt, let's start eradicating debt at other levels or other places, whatever that is. And I'm saying this is not knowing where to start, but I am saying that if you destroy the government, which you have the right to do, I guess, because it's being done, right? But if you destroy the federal government, what's going to be left for the people? And that's the challenge. So when you have, like, I'll give you an example. I was in Pennsylvania just 2 weeks ago, and I was at a restaurant, I was by myself, I was eating, and I was listening to this couple who was across the way from me, and they were talking. Understand, one of the gentleman had a Make America Great hat again, which is MAGA, which is, that he voted for Donald Trump. I heard something I never thought I would hear in my a day in my life, where this guy was legitimately saying, "Man, I'm a veteran and I'm scared to death that my veteran benefits are going to be cut out." Because that, we're talking about this, but that talks about another obstacle here. When we talk about the eradication of diversity, equity, and inclusion, they think that just impacts people who looks like me in terms of being Black. This guy's a veteran, and he has veteran services that are being eradicated, not only because of the changes that are happening in the federal government in terms of the slashes, but also in terms of the things that are happening within diversity, equity, and inclusion. Because DEI, and I hate to bust the bubble of so many people, DEI is not just about making the Black folks feel good. DEI is about giving access to services, access to opportunities to people who are handicapped, people who are veterans, people who have been economically displaced their entire lives, right? Going down to women, white women, right? So now we're talking about not just eradicating departments, but we're talking about eradicating access to entry, access to entry from an economic standpoint, access to entry from from a career perspective, from an educational perspective. When you start to tinker with the formula, don't be surprised by the result. And that's what we're seeing at a fundamental level.
I want to talk to you more about DEI, but I also want to
Sure.
talk to you about, look, I think everything is great when it's somebody else.
Mm,
But when it comes
preach.
home to you, when you get gored, that's when you get upset. So the
Yes.
government is awful and terrible, except for the things you need from it. This
Right.
the fellow you were listening to in the restaurant, yeah, it might be great for him to wear his MAGA hat and be supportive of the president and want all these things until it's his veteran benefits that get cut. And when his veteran benefits get cut, then suddenly he realizes, oh, wait a minute, this isn't what I meant. So
Mhm.
you've brought up so many different things. So let's get to DEI for a
Sure.
second, because I think these two issues are connected. And then I want to go back to the corporate side of this because you've raised a lot of issues there as well. So talk a little bit about DEI. Talk a little bit about what it really means. Frankly, again, if you polled this, if you went out in the street and you talked to people about it, I'm sure they would say DEI equals affirmative action. And
Mhm.
I think what the president has very successfully done is made people think that DEI, for some reason, is evil. And
Yes.
for example, I mean, I personally find it rather insulting, that only black people, only people of color could possibly get their jobs because they get special preferences. And
Yeah.
when the horror of the plane crash in Washington not long ago, I mean, his first comment was, it has something to do with DEI, which is ridiculous. Talk to us a little bit about
Mm.
DEI. Talk to us about what it is, what it was supposed to do, what it does, why it was successful. And if you could, why is it such a hot button for so many people?
Yeah, yeah, this is first, let me
A
say this. You're
lot of
really good at
questions
this.
there.
No, no, let me say this. You're really good at this, and I'm having a blast having this conversation with you.
Good.
So thank
Um,
thank you so much for having this podcast forum because you're
I
killing
think
it.
look, I think these are important questions. I think
Yeah.
people out there don't get it. And
Yes.
people hear buzzwords, DEI. Oh, that means giving unqualified people of color jobs, which, by the way, takes it away from people who look like me, allegedly,
Sure.
and just gives it to people because they happen to be of color.
Right. Yeah, it's interesting because when we talk about DEI and you ask the average person what DEI is, because I hear these people, DEI is bad, DEI is evil. I'm that ass that will actually look at you and say, okay, what is DEI? And you'd be amazed at the number of words that they use to fill that acronym, right? But DEI is really
Oh,
diversity, equity, and inclusion, right? So I will break it down: diversity, equity, inclusion. And DEI, in some form or fashion, has really been in place. You're really talking back in the from the creation of the Civil Rights Act, right? So forms of DEI, whether it be integration, whether it be that abolition of the abolishment of the Jim Crow laws, going down the line, right? But what people often attribute DEI to is affirmative action. And what's interesting, though, is that DEI really did not get started in terms of the parlance of the land until the George Floyd assassination. When George Floyd happened, now all of a sudden you have all these companies that, the Starbucks of the world, the Facebooks of the world, the Targets of the world, the John Deere, go on down the line, where all of a sudden they were saying Black Lives Matter, we stand for it. Now we're going to create DEI processes in place. Where we're going to make sure that people, women and people of color, understand they say women, people of color, and I'll get back to that in a second, have an opportunity to be hired for our organizations and to matriculate up the levels of executive ranks. So DEI as a concept really started to get fuel to the point where when you look on LinkedIn and you look at the number of people from January, from probably 2021 to not really 2020 to maybe about 2023, who identified as people who held some rank within diversity, right? That number quadrupled by 128%. But what was interesting though is when you look at those folks who got those jobs, when you're talking about chief diversity officers, their average tenure was only a year and a half. And I've had the opportunity to talk to a number of chief diversity officers or former chief diversity officers. And I asked, why did you only stay with company ABC for a year, maybe 2 years, maybe 3 years, maybe 6 months? And here's what they said fundamentally. The notion of DEI sounds great to companies and it looks great on their website. But then when you actually get in to try to do the process of diversity, they were getting slammed because they would try to implement a diversity policy for the IT department, only to hear that the IT department won't do it. Or as one executive told me, as she's having a conversation with another executive about the fact that he was not meeting the diversity requirements for the position. He said, "Why do you always talk about diversity? Why are you making everything into race?" And her response was, "Well, it's kind of implied in my job title, right? That's
Yeah.
kind of why I'm here."
Yeah.
And I bring it back to DEI. I think that I'm going to be in the minority when I say this. I actually don't have any issue with the complete destruction of DEI policies and programs. I don't have any problem with it. Say get rid of it, right? I don't have any problems with it because let's break it down. Diversity, that's a fact. The fact of the matter is, depending on where you live, depending on where you go, if you walk down the street, and I'm saying walk outside your neighborhood, you're going to encounter somebody who doesn't look like you, talk like you, think like you, therefore they're not you, right? Diversity is just the nature of living in the United States. Equality, that's a theory, right? Inclusion, well, if you want to include me, right? But I think DEI as a concept is fundamentally busted because it's something that the people who are in power have the power to grant, and the people who are in power have the power to take away, as we're currently seeing. So why I don't have a particular problem with the fact that you're getting rid of diversity, equity, and inclusion is because now, if we really want to make it about merit, let's roll. Let's do it. Let's make everything based on merit. Because I hate to say this to people. There are people who look like me who are coming out with the college degrees. There are people who look like me who are coming out with the master's degrees. There are people who look like my wife who are coming out with the master's degrees. My wife is African American. Because when you look at the sheer number of people who are coming out with advanced degrees, Black women are at the forefront. They're getting more degrees than white women. They're getting more degrees than white men. So if we're talking about it from a pure meritocracy, which is white America often talks about, it's rock. But judge me based on the content of my character, judge me based on my education, and give me the same opportunities you're giving your cousins, your neighbors, your friends. Give me those opportunities, because DEI, when we talk about affirmative action, it means something different when all of a sudden, if you're giving a position to your cousin and you're hoping he's going to grow into the role, that's DEI. That's affirmative action. But that's the affirmative action that we don't talk about in the books, right?
But isn't the purpose of DEI, excuse me, isn't the purpose of DEI and isn't the purpose of affirmative action
Mhm.
to deal with, let's talk about a phrase that people don't like, intrinsic racism.
Sure.
So a, a black guy and a white guy, I know it's going to sound like a joke, a black guy and a white guy walk into an interview and they're equally qualified,
Mhm.
right? But you pick the white guy because the employer is white, and so they pick
Mhm.
someone they're more comfortable with. By definition, that discriminates against the black person. but it
It
al-
does.
but it also continues this process. I mean, women have struggled with this forever. They don't make as
Hmm.
much as men. How ridiculous is that? And so my point on DEI is, I mean, there's so many things you said. I'm glad you quoted Dr. King because I was going to get to him also.
Hmm.
How do we get past this? Why aren't we in a post-racial world? If you look at other countries who struggled with
Hmm.
slavery,
Hmm.
they're way past us. I mean, look at
Sure.
Brazil. Look at Brazil. You know, Brazil had slavery. I think they eliminated it around the time we eliminated it. But race is not remotely the issue in a country like that as it is here.
Hmm.
Why? Why? Where are we? 1865 to 2025. I mean, why are we here 150 years after the fact? Still dealing with racism. Why when a black guy and a white guy walk in for an
Yeah.
interview, it isn't a pure meritocracy?
Yeah, because America is the ultimate caste system, right? And I wish that we would just call it for what it is. America is such a caste system that you have black kids who grew up saying, I want to be a rapper, I want to be an athlete. Why? Because I want to make a lot of money. They don't look at me and say, I want to grow up and be you. That takes too much work, right? They don't look at me and say, I want to be you, because there are not as many examples of what that looks like as compared to LeBron James. God bless LeBron James, and I love him. America is
But
such
there's
a
but there's
caste.
there's there's there is one LeBron James. There is
Right.
one Michael Jordan, right?
Hmm.
So maybe the bigger issue here is how do we get minorities? I mean, you talked about your wife, for example, and others.
Hmm.
Are they the outliers? Are they unusual? Are there so many more white men, white women, whatever, than people of color getting this? I realize there's a huge increase in people of color
Yes.
getting advanced degrees. How do we equal it? And do we even need DEI? Because I think that's where you're going. I think you're going to the point of no, we could achieve our goals without it. Is that and the goal to me is not that 20% or whatever the number is should be minority. That
Hmm.
is meaningless to me. I mean, it's
Hmm.
important to help people, but that's not the goal. The goal should be you and I walk into a meeting, and if you have a better interview, you get the job. If have a
Absolutely.
better interview, I get the job.
Right.
What's wrong with
You know,
that?
that's the goal. I mean, in fact, that's the theory of interviewing. The theory of interviewing says that if I walk into a job and I'm as good as I know I am, and I'm better than you, and I interview better than you, then I should get the job. But the reality is not often the case, right?
Sure.
Or on the other side of that, even if I get the job because I'm the better, what you will hear, because I hear this all the time in corporate America, is he checked the boxes. Well, he checked the boxes is just a great way of saying that a diversity hire, right? Which in itself, as you stated earlier, is about as insulting as you possibly can get. I think that fundamentally, it is very difficult. And this gets back to the, why do we still struggle with racism? And when I brought up the whole caste system, it is fundamentally, look, I learned grit at an early age. I absorbed grit. I was given grit because of not just because of the fact that I had these tremendous parents, but also because of the things that I experienced. Racism has been my greatest teacher. Racism has allowed me to survive cross burnings. Racism has allowed me to survive, literally being urinated on by white men. Racism has allowed me to deal with teachers at an early age who looked at me and said, "You are fundamentally inadequate." Why? Because I was black and I lived in an all white neighborhood, and I went to school with all white kids, and I was in the Catholic school equivalent of special education, even though I tested higher than all my peers, right? Racism has taught me, though, that in America, it's not the person who's best for the job is not oftentimes the person who gets the job. So the very notion of DEI in theory is a wonderful, wonderful thing, and I would love to do it. But there is no point in modern history or in our history as a whole where the oppressor has ever really sympathized with the oppressed. It just doesn't happen. Even when we look at what happened in terms of DEI being such a, the powerful driver of DEI during the George Floyd moment. Part of the reason why the George Floyd moment was so instrumental, like Black men have been getting killed in some form or fashion by police forever. But part of the reason I truly believe this, that that was such a strong inflection moment for America is because we are going through COVID. And when you classify what a minority is anyone who's socially, politically, and economically disenfranchised. That's what a minority is. But when we were all home during COVID and we didn't know if we were going to have jobs, we didn't know if all of a sudden, this pandemic was going to wipe us all out. And we were dealing with the deaths of our loved ones, we're dealing with the fact that we didn't even know our kids were going to be able to go back to school. Everybody was a minority in that moment. I don't care if you're a white, I don't care if you're black, if you're Asian, if you're a Latino going down the line, everybody was a minority because we are all politically, economically, and socially disenfranchised. So when George Floyd happened, we had empathy. That was the only time that I could think of in my life where there was a collective sense of empathy other than 9/11, other than when there's some great tragedy. The George Floyd moment was one of those great tragedies. Then you had this push for DEI. But now that's when the majority, those people in power, started to get back to power because we started to go back to life as normal. When we started to go back to life as normal, now all of a sudden you started to see this whole thing about these conversations about DEI started to wane a bit. The love that was given for DEI started to wane a bit because there was no longer a sense of empathy because I was no longer in that position because now I'm back to my position of power. That's why I talk about DEI as a whole, as a concept, is so structurally flawed because DEI as a concept is not something that the mass embodies, is not something that the mass pushes. When you have the power to say, I'm going to do DEI, and then you have the power to pull it away, as we've seen with so many organizations, especially after President Trump was inaugurated, that makes me believe and it makes me understand that DEI as a core concept is flawed. And that's why I don't have a problem with it being taken away. Because don't pretend like you care about me. Show me you care about me. Show me you care about me in terms of structure. Show me you care about me in terms of policy. But if you don't care about me, just be honest about that and let it go.
So you're saying you don't need the Office of DEI. Just do it. Just do it. Just hire the right people, but will we get there if we do that? Will we get there if your children don't get to see their father in a certain role, if they don't get to see
Mhm.
their mother in a certain role? How do we get there to a society that is colorblind? I mean, I think a lot of Americans tied all this to George Floyd and have issues
Sure.
with it. And a lot of people, I think a lot of white people started seeing reverse discrimination in their minds that, oh, suddenly they couldn't go on a corporate board, let's say, or they couldn't get the job because there was a quota system or something.
Sure.
How do we get past this? As an
I don't know
employer,
that you
how do we get past this?
Yeah, I don't know that you do. And again, I run the risk of sounding like this negative Nelly, but I don't know that you do. My neighbor, I'll never forget my neighbor telling me, and he calls me Jay. He goes, Jay, I could say this to you because I know you're cool, right? My neighbor
Yeah,
happens to be white, right? So that's code for you're a cool black guy, right?
yeah.
And I'll never forget he said, his son is a police officer and his son was up for a detective's position. And he goes, he didn't get it because he's not the right skin color. And I go, what's the right skin color? He goes, well, they're giving all these quotas to black people, and those are the people who are getting the position. I've been around his son. His son's not bright. His son's not exceptional.
But
But
isn't
in
it
his
easier to say that? Isn't it
but
easier to
that but that's my
say,
point. But that's my point. In his mind, not only is his son exceptional, from the perspective based on the color of his skin, it should be his as a result of the caste system that says we are the majority, we are the powerful, therefore we should have the roles, right? And if we're talking about how do we get to the point of, getting to a colorblind society means let's just be honest. Let's just be honest. I I actually appreciate when someone says to me directly, I think white people should be the people in power. I can roll with that because now we can have a conversation as opposed to somebody who leads with, I don't care if you're black, green, purple, or yellow. I would care if I was purple because I'm dead. You would care if I was yellow. You would. Right? So let's be honest. But I think when we skirt around the issue, right? Or when you do something along the lines of um, when you do something along the lines of saying, well, I'm not racist, I believe in we're going to give the position to the person who's right for the role. But then you find out the person who's right for the role is somebody that you as a leader identify with because he's your cousin, or you identify with him because he's a friend of a friend. I can't tell you the number of organizations that I've worked for where I find out that, the executive vice president of operations, who might not be very good at his role, is the distant cousin to the CEO.
Right. Right.
Right? So to answer your question, it's in a caste society, which is what America is. I don't know that we ever get to a colorblind society because there is power in being white. There is power in being part of the majority. There's power in being, you know, um, following ideas and principles that says you may not be, you may never shake the hand of the man or the woman that you put in office. But if that man or the woman makes you feel like in some shape or form they're standing up for your race, not just for your policies, but for your race, you're contributing to that caste society, even if it's at the exclusion of what you know, even if it means that you lose your government benefits, even if that means that your parents suffer, even if that means that your people, your community suffer. You're voting for your race before you're voting for what's right. That gets back to that whole point about caste. I would love to live in a colorblind society. I would love for my kids to actually be judged based on the fact that they are just fundamentally good. But I don't know what that looks like because I've never had the experience of it.
Right. And every time you think we're getting closer, we get a step behind. Let me turn you a little bit because I really want to talk
Yeah,
about the corporate side of this also.
sure.
I don't think I have ever seen in my lifetime corporations shifting gears as quickly as they have.
Yeah,
George
yeah,
Floyd, the tragedy of George Floyd happened. And then people jumped on the DEI, I don't want to call it bandwagon, but realized the need for it. Then
sure.
President Trump gets elected, slams DEI. I think
Right.
a lot of his voters believed it was discriminatory against them. Um, but you saw a lot of companies quickly, first create it and then eliminate it. Have you seen policy changes of this magnitude like this? I mean, it just seems so quick and so dramatic.
No, I haven't. I haven't. I've, I've seen companies make policy changes on things like we're taking away the hot dogs at Costco, right? Or,
I
you
love
know,
the hot dogs at Costco. Please,
yeah,
not that.
right, right. I've seen things
Anything but
like that.
that.
I've seen things like that. But to go from 4 years ago, I'm laughing because it's comedy to me. It's comedy to me. I'll never forget my father told me when I was younger. He goes, "You're going to you know that you've become an old man when life becomes a series of comedies to you." And now I can't find myself but laugh right all the time at the sheer brilliance of my father and the fact that I'm finally old enough to know what that kind of feels like. But I laugh because 4 years ago, it was we're people, we have to grow together, we have to love to. This doesn't work for us. Right? I mean, that's what companies say. It doesn't work for us any longer. It's not, Microsoft, when they eradicated their DEI policies, there was an internal memo that went around where the department lead of whatever department it was legitimately said, there's no longer a business case for diversity, right? And that's why we're getting rid of it. Oftentimes when I hear people say that, what they're essentially saying is that diversity as a whole is too tough for us to deal with. Because when you look at all the various companies that are now getting rid of their DEI policies, part of it is their companies. And I'll give you a prime example of this. A very large oil company whose name I'm not going to mention here, a very large oil company came to me and wanted me to do a diversity training for them. Cool, let's rock. But they wanted me to turn over all of my materials to them, my PowerPoints, my handouts, and any accompanying information, because in the words of the VP of Human Resources, who was very embarrassed when she asked me for this, she said, we have to have this stuff vetted by legal because we don't want to run afoul of the administration. Because if anything within your training says anything about diversity, even though it's diversity training, anything says anything about critical race theory, nobody knows what the hell that is. If anything says anything about something that will put us on the radar of the Trump administration, we have concerns because we have federal contracts. I
So
ended
is
up
that really what's going on? I mean, that is the question, isn't it, Jason?
Mhm,
Isn't the question here, are people doing this? So you said two things. You said
mhm,
that a lot of companies are starting to say, well, it's either too hard to meet the diversity or we don't
sure.
need it anymore or whatever. That's a very different statement than, oh my goodness, we're very nervous about what the Trump administration is going to say. So we need to do this so they won't be angry at us. So what is
Yes.
going on here? I mean, it's a huge difference if a company just says, look, we're going to hire minorities. We're going to be inclusive. We don't care. It's the character. It's how good your education is, as you said.
Yeah.
What is it? Are people bowing down? Are people giving in? Are people doing this just to make the administration happy? Or do people think they can meet these goals? And by goals, I don't mean numbers. By goals,
Sure.
I mean moral numbers. Um, there's a huge difference there. How is corporate America looking at this?
Corporate America's scared. And I know this
Of
because I
what?
hear of the silent, the not so silent minority of online keyboard warriors who have a particular political bent. They're scared of the public humiliation that comes with running afoul of the current administration. They're scared of pissing off their customers. They're scared of a lot of things. And understand when I keep prefacing this with scared, that's something I've not seen from corporate America. So I've been very proud to be a consultant for since about 2005. And fear is not something that I'm often associated with companies, but that's something that I'm starting to see across the board now is that there's this fear that they're going to be, vilified online. There's this fear that for companies that do have federal contracts, that they're going to lose those federal contracts. As I've seen several of them lose contracts. There's this fear that they are going to end up on a social media post from the president. There's this fear that's driving the eradication of many of these policies. But it also, and it gets back to my original statement, Rich, that the best way to galvanize people is to have an enemy. And the enemy right now is diversity. The enemy right now is equality. The enemy right now is inclusion. And when you are able to place the spotlight on DEI without giving a core fundamental education on what DEI really means, companies that have that, like I'll give you an example. A very well-intentioned colleague of mine, very well-intentioned colleague of mine, said, I'm concerned because he had diversity in his website, right? He had diversity, but it wasn't diversity of, I do diversity work. It was diversity of opinion, diversity of ideas. And he said to me that one day he woke up and he had over 100 comments on his website about how he's a social justice warrior, how he's this, how he's that, he's that. And when I say he's a well-intentioned guy, he's a very nice guy. But he said to me, don't they know I'm not black? Right? He
Because
said
you
that
can
to me.
only feel like this if you're black. I mean,
Right.
only black people care about these issues.
And he said this to me, and I go, what do you want me to do with that comment? Right? Because I'm at the risk of telling you to go, you know what off, right? He goes, no, I didn't mean it like that. I didn't mean it like that. He goes, but I wish they understood that I was just talking about diversity of opinion. I don't do
Right.
diversity programs. But again, that's the fear that's going on right now is that diversity as a whole right now, DEI is being pilfered as the bad policy that's led America toward, you know, you know, that's not making America great again. I remember I was doing an interview with the Washington Examiner, and um, I thought it was just going to be me and the correspondent talking about DEI. And this was right around the time where the Supreme Court was talking about changing the affirmative action policies for schools, for
Right.
colleges. And it just so happened that this woman named, I think her name was Diane Canada, was on, and I bring her name up because I really like her. We are fundamentally different in terms of how we view things, but I really like her. And Diane was making points. So we started talking about, affirmative action or DEI policies and how they've led to white children being indoctrinated into policies and ideas of critical race theory, which made them feel guilty for being white. And she was bringing up how there was this Asian man, because it was always, she always brought it back to the Asians, right? She was bringing up the fact that there was this Asian man who scored for he had a spectacular SAT score and was not admitted because the affirmative action policies, catered toward Black people. And she really made a point of saying,
which is why the plaintiffs were Asian who brought the lawsuit.
exactly, exactly. So she kept bringing it back to that, kept bringing it back to that. Well, fast forward to those policies being changed or eradicated, and you look at the fact that the admittance rate for African Americans kind of has grown, whereas the admittance rate for Asian Americans has kind of remained stagnant. In some cases, has fallen behind. Right. So when we talk about, these policies, I wish people would just finally say, you're not talking about meritocracy here, right? You're not talking about anything other than you just don't like the fact that there are people of color who are getting positions that you think you should have.
Right. As if it's their right.
Not because you're good, but because it's your right based on the color of your skin. That gets back to the point that I brought up about the caste system. Let's just be honest. Okay, get rid of DI. I don't care. Eradicate it. Let's just be candid and say you feel like all of the positions of power should be filled by white people. Just say it.
And then you
And then
could
we
have
go
that
from there.
discussion. Yeah.
And then we go
Yeah.
from there. I'm good with that. Because
So
now we can start talking about merit.
how do companies make these? I mean, you deal with so many companies. How do they
Yes,
make
sir.
these decisions? Look, I've spent most of my life in the political world. Decisions
Sure.
are made on polls. You go out there and you ask people, you ask, 1,000 people a question, you get an
Hmm.
answer, and it could help guide what you want to do. How do these companies make these decisions? Because when you start talking, as you are, about fear, fear
Yes.
is not based on rationality. Fear is not based on truth. Fear is
Hmm.
based on a gut feeling, a gut
Yes,
sensation.
sir.
How do these companies make these decisions? And what's the balance between who do you make happy? Who do you annoy? So, at the same token, I may go to a company and buy their product because I believe in the social policy they're doing.
Hmm.
Someone else may look at the exact same social policy and say, I'm not going there because I disagree with them.
Right.
How do C-suite officials who you advise every single day, how do they
Hmm.
make that decision? What's the calculus?
Yeah, you'd be surprised at how little calculus there really is around whether those policies exist or whether those policies are abolished. Because really the calculus comes down to, and this is something that people don't talk a lot about, is what kind of pushback are we getting from our board of directors? What kind of pushback are we getting from our shareholders? Because people are always going to follow the money, right? Um, some of it has to do with what our customers are saying. I use the example of Harley Davidson. Harley Davidson had created a fairly robust DEI policy, right? A fairly robust DEI office, and they got rid of it. Why? Because a lot of their constituents, their customers, were people who didn't really care for DEI as a whole,
Right,
based on what they
right.
understood of it. So that was a decision, and I don't have a
But did it
problem with
stop
that.
them from buying motorcycles?
No, no,
Yeah,
but that's just it. It's the fear of, right? So,
I
and that's
see.
why I get back to the calculus. It's the fear that we're going to lose something. And when you have a target who says, we're no longer going to prioritize DEI, we're going to rebrand it. And then you
Right.
see that they have a $15 billion impact. If I'm Target, that's when I'm looking around saying, man, I think we might have miscalculated that, because that's a case where the customers actually said, we're taking our money away from you. But again, but that's something you can see, that's something you can feel. You'd be amazed at the number of corporate boardrooms where people are going based on their gut. People are
Right.
going based on, I'm feeling like because they happen to look at Twitter that day, or X, excuse me, they happen to look at X that day, or they happen to look at Instagram that day, and they happen to realize, not even realizing that their algorithm is keyed toward a certain thing, right? That makes them believe a certain thing about reality. So there's not a lot of calculus that goes into it. But if your board of directors is coming back saying, we don't like this, and the shareholders don't like this, that calculus is an economic one, right?
But you
But
brought up you brought up Target. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to
yes,
cut you off there.
no,
So
go
please,
ahead, please. No, please.
you brought up Target.
Mhm,
As I understand what Target did, is not that it eliminated its DEI, quote unquote DEI program, but it had a program of buying from minorities. It had a program
mhm,
of putting on the shelf products created by minority-owned companies. Well,
mhm,
that's a different story than hiring someone because they're black or white or whatever. But
100%.
to give someone an opportunity, let's make believe. I think I saw something on TV for a woman who made soap, a
Mhm,
black woman who had a soap company, right? And
yes,
and she actually, as I remember the story, she used to go into Targets and like leave her soap on the shelf. It was really interesting. And Target eventually saw it and bought her goods. Well, they're not going to do that anymore.
right.
This is a different story. This is an economic story. Giving people an opportunity to sell their products, to break into a Target, a CVS, something like that, to be a vendor to them is a
Yeah,
career changing, corporate changing, life changing situation.
right.
These are two separate issues. How does a company like Target deal with this? And how does the public deal with it? I listened to the woman. A lot of people were boycotting Target. She said,
Right.
don't boycott Target. Buy my products, buy them off the shelf. Make sure that all my products get sold. How do you
Yes.
advise companies? How do you deal with this? Should they keep her goods on the shelf? Should she still be a vendor? Is there a backlash against that? Which one is worse?
Yeah. God, Rich, I love your questions. Let me let,
Well,
let
we'll
me
do
say
we'll
this.
do this again. So
Yeah, yeah, let's do this again. What I'll say is that what I tell companies is you always got to follow the money, right?
yeah,
And if a product's paying you out, if a stream of revenue is paying you out, then you continue to do it, right?
right.
Um,
So should we all go to Target and buy go into Target, find her products, buy
yeah,
them, and walk out?
right.
Don't buy anything else. Buy her goods. Would that send a message to the C-suite?
Maybe,
Yeah.
maybe if they're paying attention, right? But I
Well, they
think that
follow the money.
they follow the money, but I think that there's something else is look, until the day that artificial intelligence replaces every single one of us, we can't get around the fact that these companies are being led by human beings. And these are not human beings who are just making decisions based on the metrics that they see. These are not decisions that are just being made based on conversations they have in the C-suite. These are decisions that are being made at their kitchen table when they're sitting with their families. These are decisions that are being made when they're sitting around with their neighbors, right? These are decisions that are being made when they're online and they're being inundated with multiple sources of data, right? And they're hearing it. They're at they're grilling out with their buddies, and they hear conversations around. Man, is it true that you guys prioritize selling soap for Black people? How's that fair, right?
Well, because we have
W-
20 rows of
No,
Palmolive
no,
and Dove and
but understand what understand what I'm saying here. It's when they're catching peer pressure from their peers, that has an impact because you're talking about human beings, and at our core, we still want to fit in, right? And you don't want to be seen as a social justice warrior that now all of a sudden you can't hang out with your buddies anymore because they think that you're the diversity guy. So you would then come back into the boardroom and you start making decisions not based on the metrics, not based on this is good for humanity, but I still want to fit in. So when you ask the question about what am I hearing in the boardroom, it's I'm sitting down with the CEO who says that he can no longer go to his country club because his company made an announcement that they're going to prioritize um, doing business with vendors of color. And then he goes to his country club, and all of a sudden he's excluded from the good old boys network that he had always been a part of because people are telling him that he's sold out. These are conversations that I'm having with people where I'm actually having to talk them down from feeling like, in some shape or form, they are a traitor, not to a white race, but they are a traitor to their particular silo, their particular social silo. These are conversations that I'm having. But I think, to get back to your original question, to one of your questions, America is at the verge of creating a shadow economy and shadow educational system. When I say a
What do you mean
shadow
by that?
economy,
Explain
yeah,
that.
here's what I say. Here's what I say by that. After Vice President Kamala Harris lost the election to President Trump, you'd be amazed at the number of conversations that I had with, I'm not going to say black people of color, I'm going to say with black folks, right? With black folks who literally said, we're sitting out the next election. And we're sitting out the election after that. We're sitting out the election after that because, as one person put it so eloquently, we believed in the dream of America, and America continues to show us the reality and that they don't believe in it, right? So I'm curious to see what's going to happen in the next 2 years, and I'm curious to see what's going to happen in the next 4 years in terms of Black participation. So that's one side of it. When you here's from an education and here's from an economic side, the number of Black folks and the number of people of color, now I'll go ahead and say the number of people of color as a whole, who are saying that the economic system, if the economic system says that there's no place for us from a DEI perspective, we're going to go ahead and create our own. We're going to create our own businesses. We're going to only patronize businesses of people that look like us,
This
right?
sounds like 1956 to me.
Because history is cyclical and it
Right.
always repeats itself. Now we're talking about the shadow educational side. When the Supreme Court made their decision on on eradicating affirmative action policies, historically Black colleges and universities saw a significant uptick in the number of applications that they received. Not
Saw that.
significant in terms of 2%, 3%, 4%, 5%, but 60, 70, 80% to the point where schools like Morehouse can literally say, normally we would give, a portion of the students would receive some type of Pell Grant or some type of financial aid assistance. We don't have to give that anymore because we have so many people applying for these coveted freshman roles. So what's happening is you have a number of people who would have gone to historically white colleges and universities who are now going to Black colleges and
Right.
universities. So what we're seeing, getting back to your point about where this is kind of like the 1950s again, we're seeing elements of our society that have said, okay, you don't want to play with this anymore? Okay, we'll go back to our own.
So are
So
we
what
just
this
segregating ourselves more and more and more? Are the inroads of integration that we've made over these last 50, 60 years being reversed?
Possibly, possibly. Look, my mom and dad, and I always bring up my mom and dad. My mom and
I'm
dad
glad they're
said,
back in the conversation. I missed
right.
that.
No, I love that. I love that. My mom and dad always said, play with the people who want to play with you, not the ones who don't.
Sure.
Right. And if the
That is
majority is
wise.
telling the minority that that we don't want to play with you anymore because you make us feel guilty or because we don't think you're, smart enough, bright enough, human enough, okay, we'll go play with ourselves. Right? We'll go hang out with people who are just like us. And I think that's what unfortunately is potentially happening in this country. That we have look, the I'm even seeing this in my business. I mean, I'm even seeing that in my business, you have people who are legitimately saying, I want in America, and now I'm talking about millennials and Gen Z because I love those generations of people. And I know it's not popular for Gen Xers to say that, but I love millennials and Gen Z because they're advancing that conversation. You have people who are saying, I don't want to work for companies that don't prioritize diversity. I don't want to work for, and these are white people saying this, young white people are saying this.
Sure.
I don't want to work for companies who make my friend Jose over here feel like he's less than because his parents came over here illegally, even though he you know, went on and, they worked 2 to 3 jobs to make sure he and his brothers and sisters got their education. He's got a college degree. He's out here contributing to society. But you have a society as a whole that says because he has brown skin, he's illegal, therefore, and his parents are illegal, therefore he's evil. So they choose not to work in those organizations, or they
Right.
choose to form unions against those organizations because they feel like they need somebody to stand up for them when their voices no longer matter. These are things
I
that I'm
understand.
seeing.
I understand that. What I don't understand, because I know it's not the right way to be. By not
So,
voting, they're hurting themselves. And what I have seen through my career is
yeah,
one of the reasons blacks, one of the reasons Hispanics, one of the reasons people of color
yeah,
have grown in power is because they vote and they vote
yes,
frequently as a block, not uniformly, obviously. But I mean,
sure,
you look at certain races. By races, I mean electoral races, not ethnic races. But
sure,
look, there's a huge Senate race coming up in Georgia next year. Well, if the
mhm,
if the black population of Georgia sits that one out, the Democrat's going to lose. I mean, this isn't
sure,
even close. The reason he will win is because of blacks. That gives them
yes,
tremendous power and influence. Black women in the Democratic Party are so incredibly important that, decisions are made on policy based on we cannot afford to offend black women because we'll lose. So to
yes.
sit out, if they sit out 26, 28, and beyond, they'll lose power. They'll lose influence. And I hope they'll understand that at some point.
It's interesting, and I'm so glad you said that because look, the power of the vote is incredibly important. But I mean, you work in politics, so I'm going to say something. Please rebut me because offer rebuttal because you have intimate knowledge that I don't. But a lot of times, people's votes come down to people's emotions and how
Totally,
particular,
completely.
right?
Sure.
So if you have
It's
in the
sometimes
case,
irrational. I mean, if you look at this past election,
yeah,
I mean, I think a lot of Hispanics, I think a lot of blacks, you can argue made the wrong choice, but they
mhm,
voted for something emotionally as opposed to even what was in their best interest.
100%, 100%. I'll never forget. I'll never forget hugging my wife on the night that it was clear that President Trump was going to be, our president-elect.
The
And
first time or the second time?
the second time,
Uh-huh.
thank you. Which is weird to say, right? Right? It
Yeah.
was weird to say. But the second time, and there were a lot of emotions that were going on for a lot of people. But what came out over the course of several conversations, via social media, in our friend group, cousins, whatever the case might be, is for and I'm going to speak on behalf of black women based on conversations I have with black women,
Well,
right?
you could get in trouble later.
Right, right. But here's what was said is in the case of Kamala Harris, and people can say she was the wrong candidate, people can say she hedged on a number of things, people can say she should have shown up more assertively in her interview on The View, whatever the case might be, right? But it's we gave you the best of us as you, the white majority, have said you're looking for. She was light skinned. She was, multiracial. She was quote unquote articulate. She was educated. She had served at every level of the federal government that you could think of, right? State and federal government you could think of. She was the best of us, and you still said she's not good enough.
Hmm.
So if you're saying she's not good enough, what are you saying about the rest of us, right?
That is an
And
interesting vantage point I have never thought of. That
so
is really because if she were white and had the exact same credentials, people would have been going, "What a superstar. How amazing." But instead, we spent how much time talking about, well, what was her relationship with Willie Brown like? And is that why
100%.
she got where she got? And I find this, I practiced law many, many years ago with a black guy who
Hmm.
went, I might have it backwards, I think Harvard undergrad, Stanford Law School. And he said to me, every time I walk into a room, every time I know everyone's looking at me and saying, How did I get into Harvard? How did I get into Stanford? Well, obviously, I was one of those that would just, pick to fill a box or a quota or something. And that must be difficult. And your point about Vice President Harris is a very interesting one that I've literally never considered. But yeah, if you turn down our best, what about the
Even when,
best?
yeah, even when you consider President Obama, and look, he fit. I mean, legitimately, he was the male version of Kamala Harris from the perspective of. No, I can't even say that because she was actually more qualified than he was, just in terms of the number of years that
What
she
they've done.
served as a politician, right? In
And
terms of what
in
they've
and
done.
so many different roles. And sure.
But here's the other side of that is when you look at President Obama, and that was such an inflection point for so many people of color because Chris Rock had just had that movie back in 2001 or 2002, whatever it was, called Head of State, where the joke for the whole movie was right, the idea of a black president, and here you
Right.
have a black president. And I will tell you that as people watched how President Obama was treated, how his identity was constantly questioned, his birthright was constantly questioned, a bunch of
By
things
the current president.
by the by the current president and by a number of people. There was still this feeling amongst so many of us of if they would do that to the best and brightest of us, as you've defined the best and brightest of us, what would they do to us? And then you see that play out again with Vice President Kamala Harris. So that gets back to, yes, I do agree that the vote is so critically important because when you look at the advancements in this country, it's happened as a result of the vote. It happened as a result of the number of politicians who, have worked incredibly hard in order to advance civil rights across the board. But we don't have the pain of that our ancestors had where they were forced to drink out of segregated water fountains or have milkshakes being thrown on them when they were sitting at lunch counters for whites only, right? When you don't have that level of because if you turn off social media, right, you kind of don't know what's going on with the rest of the world when you don't have that everyday reminder of racism, right? When you don't have that everyday reminder of if you want these issues to change, if you want these experiences to change, therefore you vote, then all of a sudden you start to detach. And that's what I'm talking about in terms of the shadow economy, the education, the shadow, whatever the case might be, because there's this level of detachment that's happening in our country that concerns me. And it concerns me to the point of I'm starting to wonder, are we going back to the days of the 50s where we were segregated? But caveat being, we have more money today than what we had before. And I'm talking about ethnic minorities, right?
And
You
it's
have
by
more
choice to
access.
some degree.
It's by choice to some degree, but it's also the internet fuels a lot of this. So
Right.
now all of a sudden, if I can make money through online sales and you don't know that you're buying from somebody who's black, right? Or whatever the case might be, there are all these other opportunities that people have in order to make money, in order to fuel their economy, in order to fuel their communities. So I will say this that even though I originally stated that I don't have a problem if you abolish DEI, because now I'm speaking as an idealist, because I would love to have a day where everything is based on meritocracy. I'm still saying this as somebody who believes in the American dream, even though I've lost hope for America. I've lost hope for America where we currently are, but I still have this dream that one day, in some shape or form, we can be better than what we've allowed ourselves to be today. Because the only way we can ever be better, Rich, is by having these conversations. And I don't care if I have to have 15, 20 of these conversations per hour, per day, per month, whatever the case might be. If it's advancing this idea that we have a right and we have an obligation for our kids, for the generations who are coming behind us to actually do better than what we're currently doing. That's what I love about America. But we're
Right.
currently not doing that. And that's what scares me.
But you have to stay in the system. People have to stay in the system. People have to stay involved in government, involved in politics. They have to raise their voices. They have to belong to organizations. They have to be
Mhm.
heard. They have to have these conversations, but they have to work to make change. And one of the
But
things you brought up about the vice
right.
president, let's be honest with each other.
Yeah.
Black men left her in droves. Black men,
Mm,
who should have been championing her, did not, and left her in important places like Milwaukee,
right.
like Detroit, like Philadelphia. I mean, if black men had turned out in Obama-like numbers,
Hmm.
just to make, because you made the comparison,
Absolutely.
she would have won those three states. She would have been president. So, I mean, I'm not putting it on black men at all. I
Sure.
mean, there's a lot of other things that went on here. A lot of other people, a lot of other groups who didn't support her. But I mean, we also have to look, blacks and minorities are not monoliths, and we shouldn't look at them
We,
as monoliths. They're not.
right. I
But
was just, the reason why I'm laughing, forgive me for saying this, for
like,
interrupting you. The reason why I'm laughing is, look, I didn't say we weren't sexist,
yeah, well, that too. Yeah, I know.
right? Let's
We
let's
we
be
didn't even
fair.
get into that one.
Right,
So.
right.
Hey, look, I can't hold you here all day. You got a life and a job to do. But let me just ask you, we've talked a lot about race, we've talked a lot about DEI, we've talked a lot about the firings in Washington. What
Yes, sir.
else is Greer Consulting being asked to talk about? So when you get a phone call, when you get on an airplane, you fly someplace, you go sit
Hmm.
down with CEOs, what's
Yes, sir.
on their mind? What are they asking Greer Consulting? What do they want to know about? And what type of advice are you giving them?
Yeah, great
And I'm not
question.
asking for
So,
specifics. Let me just be clear. You
no,
don't
it's
need to
okay.
talk
It's
about
okay.
it, but I'm just curious.
Yeah, when I'm sitting in front of CEOs, when I'm sitting in front of executives, what they're asking me about is perhaps they're an organization that is currently going through some type of union organizing drive where a union is seeking to represent the employees. And it's, can you please help us to mitigate these situations? So we'll come in and we'll work with employees, we'll work with managers with the hope that employees don't go union if it's not right for the organization. They're asking us to come in to talk about employee relations where there's a breakdown within their organization. Managers are going one way, employees are going another way, and we're brought in to effectively be social mediators. So, my background, I have a bachelor's degree in social work, a master's degree in social work, and a master's in HR management. So, I often say to people, I am legitimately living my purpose because I am essentially bringing people back together. And another thing that employers are asking me, and this has actually happened within the past 2 months, and you can kind of read the tea leaves here when I say that, it's how do we take people who are so opposed to each other based on politics, who are so opposed to each other based on what they've heard about each other, and how do we get them to come back together to the point where we can have a more harmonious workplace? So it's my role, it's my task, it's my purpose, and it's my blessing to be able to come in and do those things for organizations.
Well, that's terrific and such important work. And look, you've been extraordinarily generous with your time. And
Hey,
I
thank
just
you.
want to, I appreciate it. I'd love to do this again. We can
Most
have another
definitely.
discussion about where we are a few months down the road and what this means. But Jason, I just want to thank you.
Hey, thank you,
Very
Rich.
interesting. I think people are going to really, you answered a lot. People have a lot of questions about this issue and it's important. So, let me end this by saying this. Jason Greer, thank you. And please stay unconventional.
And most definitely. You're
We
fantastic.
appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
Well, thank you. So listen, to all of you who are listening, thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed this. I sure as heck did. I learned a lot. I think you probably did as well. So tune in next time. We're going to keep talking about these big issues because, the important thing, and as Jason said, we got to keep talking. We got to keep raising these issues. There's nothing wrong in disagreeing. There's nothing wrong in you having a point of view that's different than mine. Let's just treat each other with respect. Let's treat each other with dignity. And that's what's really important here. And that's how we'll continue to make this country greater than it is today. And that's got to be our goal. Our goal has to be, to keep improving, keep getting better. And by having the type of conversations that Jason is suggesting, I think that's going to help a lot. So listen, thanks a lot for joining us today. I know we went through quite a lot and went for quite some time. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I do, and I look forward to catching you next time. So thank you for listening to Unconventional Times. Richard Gordon, we'll talk soon. Thank you.
You've been listening to Unconventional Times with your host, Richard Gordon. Check out all of the episodes of Unconventional Times on Apple, Google, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. To learn more about Richard Gordon and all of his unconventional conversations, head on over to unconventionaltimes.com. Thanks for listening.